Hi, I'm Danny, and I'm a consultant here at the Profs in their engineering and science admissions applications for top universities in the UK, such as Cambridge and Imperial, as well as Oxford. Today, we'll be looking at the Oxford engineering interview. We'll look at what goes into these interviews, how to prepare, and how to show off your abilities to the interviewers. So firstly, what is an Oxford engineering interview? What is it like? It involves 2 or maybe 3 interviews at various Oxford colleges. So unlike Cambridge, where you typically get 2 interviews at one college, Oxford, you'll typically get 2 or 3 interviews with at least 1 interview at 2 different colleges. So it's quite a different style to the Cambridge system. This means that you're able to show your abilities to 2 different sets of tutors at colleges that might be looking for slightly different things. Again, the differences between what colleges look for within Oxford, as with Cambridge, is that they look for slightly different things in their candidates, but typically most of the values and features of a good candidate tend to align in terms of ability and potential. So typically you'll have 1 interview in the morning and then 1 interview in the afternoon. And if it's a 3rd interview, it might happen on a different day or you might be called up again later. So plenty of chances to show your abilities and potential to the interviewers. Now, what do these interviews involve so that you know how to prepare for them? In a similar vein to other top unis in the UK, Oxford has very technical questions that they tend to ask at their interviews. These questions will test you on things such as mechanics, electricity, and various bits of maths such as calculus that they know students tend to struggle on, but they know will be useful for when studying the Oxford Engineering undergraduate degree. So I should mention in Oxford, it's known as Engineering Sciences as a course, but we'll just use engineering from now on because that's typically how most of these courses are known. In these interviews, given that there's quite a high mathematical element, they'll tend to ask questions on graph sketching. This is a skill that is, one, not really used in real life or used at A-level, but it's a good way to test candidates' abilities to think about what they've learned about different functions throughout their studies. So graph sketching questions do tend to come up quite a lot in Oxford engineering interviews, and it's good to prepare for these so that when they do come up, or if they do come up, you have a really good chance of answering the question well, also knowing what parts you might struggle on so you know where to fix, as well as when it comes to the interview, knowing what prompts might be useful for you if you know you just can't answer the question in full. And finally, a lot of the questions look at your A-level content, so the A*/A content in your A-level maths and physics studies. And the questions on this do, as I mentioned earlier, tend to range from mechanics, electricity, but can involve other things involving fields and other bits. So whatever parts of your course that you tend to struggle with, you might find a lot of other people across the country tend to struggle with those too. And then these interviewers know to ask questions based on that. So other things like waves, they know a lot of students tend to struggle on or don't understand very well, and are good questions to separate one candidate from another in terms of ability and potential. Now, how do we prepare for these interviews? Well, firstly, make sure you understand your A-level content really well. Keep looking over notes or keep looking over any in-depth explanations provided in textbooks. That way, you know your content very well and then can figure out what curveballs interviewers might be trying to throw and any changes to a scenario or approximations you might need to make based on the information they give. Also, try to read some notes or course content on their first year undergraduate degree. So this can involve newer topics such as materials, structural mechanics, maybe rotational mechanics. These topics that you don't tend to see at A-level or at least in as much depth, they can ask questions on this. And this is usually a good way to separate candidates because candidates haven't learnt these at A-level or shouldn't have learnt these at A-level really. It's a good way to see what parts of a candidate are teachable, how fluid they are and adaptable they are when it comes to learning new content. So if everyone knows how to do circular motion, then you could come up with a hard circular motion question, but then whether candidates do better on this or not could just depend on whether they have a good teacher that taught that bit of the course well, or whether the candidate just had a natural inclination for that type of topic. Whereas if you give them something at a first year undergraduate level, then most candidates won't have covered this. Not saying all, but most won't have covered this. So it's a good way to differentiate between people when they're trying to ask a question on a bit of content that no one really knows, and you can see how a student thinks, what type of things they look for when answering a problem, and how they might get to their final solution. So trying to read ahead, learn any first year undergraduate content, that will help you to be able to think like an engineer and hopefully get the right type of maths and methodology for the problems that they ask you. So when it comes to questions such as graph sketching that come up quite frequently, there's a few tips in order to ace these. Firstly, what you might want to look for is how to simplify an expression. So if they give you a function, you want to simplify that expression into as simple a form as possible to make it easier to draw. Then you try and look for any symmetry or repeating features of this. So if you know it involves a sine or a cosine, try to look for any repeating bits. And also any limits to these. So we know sine and cosine are quite bounded because they have a maximum value of 1, a minimum value of -1, so they don't get any bigger or any smaller than those values. Try to look for any roots of the equation. So that means when's the function equal to 0. We're also trying to look in certain special regions, as I call them. So what happens when x gets really, really big? And what happens when x gets really, really small? That helps to draw these functions quite well because you can find the behavior at these bits and then try and connect what happens in between. And also, if you are really struggling, I also tend to find differentiating it helps, because differentiating this function helps you find the gradient. And then if you know how the gradient changes, then you can draw the slope at different points and get the general shape of the graph. Although it can be hard to get used to this bit of the techniques. For explaining your thought process in a lot of these Oxford engineering interviews, firstly, you want to be able to tell the interviewers what you understand from the problem, as well as what you are struggling with or might not have had as much time to process given what they've said in the question. So if they give you a question on moments, for example, generally you need to find the forces and distances involved, but you're not quite sure how to do maybe the geometry or the other more technical aspects of the problem. So if you can outline that clearly, you can tell the interviewer what you're considering when approaching the problem and also what you're struggling to get a handle of. And this way, the interviewers can give you prompts and they can help you to get to a final solution. You're not expected to be able to answer questions fully from the start, because these questions are meant to be challenging. But the interviewers would like to see, as they prompt, how well you adapt to the hints and clues that they give. So they don't tend to give obvious clues. They'll tend to give slight ones, and they want to see how you react to that bit of information. Because again, similar to Cambridge, these interviews are simulating an Oxford tutorial. So they want to see how, if you were doing a tutorial at the university where you go over a problem sheet that was set in lectures, you go over this with your tutor, they want to see how you explain the parts of the problem that you understand and how you explain what you're struggling to understand and where the gap might lie, so that they can help bridge the gap. So don't try and pretend that you know everything. That's the main pitfall for most students. They try and either sit in silence and try and work out on their own, or they just try to say everything they think might be relevant and not focus on the key features that they think should be useful, and then also explain the other bits that they're less sure of as well. These features of the Oxford engineering interview make it quite difficult to know how to prepare for it because there's just so much they could ask you. But if you understand your A-level content really well, as well as some first year undergraduate content, such as rotational mechanics, materials, and some of the mathematics for engineers, this will help you to be in a good position when it comes to the interview. As with any preparation, the earlier you start, the better. So try and learn what you understand and don't understand very early on in the year. Don't try and leave it for the month before the interviews, because you really want to make a good impression at these Oxford engineering interviews. Oxford, unlike Cambridge, they tend to shortlist from the admissions test. So after you've sat the physics aptitude test that engineers sit, Oxford only tend to take just under 40% to interview. So they shortlist quite early on, and that gives you a smaller pool of candidates to pick from at interviews. So doing really well in the interviews is a good way to show or separate yourself from the other candidates, because there's a small pool. So if you do really well, it's easier to make a good impression compared to Cambridge that interviews about 75% of applicants. So it's a much larger pool to pick from on interview day. That's everything for how to ace the Oxford engineering interview. If you found that video useful, then feel free to give this video a like and subscribe, as well as share it with any friends that you think might benefit from this type of content. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them down in the comment section below, and we'll aim to reply to them. Also, if you feel like you could benefit from some support in applying for Oxford and acing these Oxford engineering interviews from a consultant such as myself, then feel free to contact the Profs on the information provided on the screen right now. And as always, best of luck in your preparation and application to your dream course.